We've finally arrived at what will undoubtedly be the longest and I imagine most popular and perhaps unpopular section of this critique, the bosses. For those who are somehow unaware, Elden Ring has quite a few boss fights, and a great many of them range from honestly excellent to utterly horrendous. And the few that are genuinely really good are often flagrantly misused or lazily recycled because the game needed more content to jam-pack this enormous world with. In many ways, the bosses epitomize everything I find to be wrong with this game, and it's kinda perfect that they do, given they are, by and large, the primary focus of the game. It really is fascinating to think about how on earth we found ourselves at this point. Boss fights in From games used to be such excellent capstones to the levels they were featured in. Sure, not all of them were winners, especially in Dark Souls 2, but most of the time, even if they were terrible, it always felt like those bosses were trying in some way to push the series forward. Elden Ring, on the other hand, is more than comfortable with taking basic enemies you encounter by the dozens and categorizing them alongside extraterrestrial godlike beings and the most prominent figures in the game's lore. Let me throw some numbers out to illustrate just exactly what it is that I mean. Elden Ring has a whopping 171 bosses. This is before the DLC, by the way. That's more than every From game from Demon Souls to Sekiro combined. Of this colossal boss roster, there are only 8, count it, 8 bosses that aren't either in some way recycled or wind up being recycled later on in the game. There's Rennala, who, although her first phase is obviously inspired to some extent by the likes of Pinwheel and the Deacons of the Deep, she is a completely unique and distinct boss on her own. There's Rykard, and sure, he uses the Storm King gimmick, but they clearly went out of their way to distinguish him from the Storm King and Yorm. There's the Fire Giant, who as far as I can tell is completely unique to his boss encounter at the mountaintops of Giants. There's Radahn, who is similarly completely unique to Elden Ring. There's Placidusax, who probably has some elements of prior dragon fights, but I feel like they're so hard to spot that counting them would feel like nitpicking. I'm also going to be generous and count Malekith and Hoarah, even though their first phases are seen in other areas of the game. There's Radagon and the Elden Beast, who are both completely unique as far as I can tell. And finally, there's Malenia, Blade of Mikola. Unfortunately, the issue that I find with Malenia is, if we really wanted to be strict and don't count Rykard, Malekith, and Hoarah over a third of the less than 5% of unique bosses, that would mean there are only 5 bosses in all of Elden Ring that are truly unique. Not only that, but the encounter rate for each boss is a whopping 4 on average. That is insane. So I've divided this boss section up into 4 parts. Bosses which get recycled either too much or in a way that is notably bad, bosses I truly enjoyed, bosses I truly did not, and those select few that I especially loathe. So let's start with the bosses that suffer from recycling. First up is the Tree Sentinel, a boss that makes one hell of a strong impression, but also becomes severely uninteresting as it's recycled over the game. And to be clear, the Tree Sentinel is a solid boss. The telegraphing of its attacks are fair, the moveset is varied but consistent, it's imposing, it looks fantastic, it animates beautifully. All in all, it's just a damn solid boss. The dust particles of doom that emanate from its weirdly wide and lingering hitbox off its slam attack feel kinda bullshit, but it's fine. I can forgive one misstep on an otherwise solid boss. Seriously, I think the Tree Sentinel's great. And then all of a sudden you have to fight 2 of them at once, and suddenly everything feels significantly worse as a result. Then you fight the Draconic Tree Sentinel, which is just the Tree Sentinel with inconsistent punish windows, some OP magic, and obnoxious AoEs with inconsistent hitboxes. Don't worry, we'll be dealing with him soon enough. We're far from through though, because we also have the Knight's Cavalry, which is basically just the common horseback knight enemies cosplaying the Tree Sentinel, cosplaying the Nazgul. They only appear at night, which is the only reason I can even remember that this game has a day and night cycle. Maybe I should have talked about that in the gameplay section. I mean, if I'm being honest, what would I have even said? However, they can be knocked off their horses, so engaging them in horseback combat is actually kinda worthwhile, even if they hop right back on their horses the second they get back to their feet most of the time. Although I feel like this had to have been patched, because I don't think I've seen them do this in any of my more recent playthroughs. Maybe it wasn't patched, maybe I've just had a weird stroke of luck, I have no idea. It's weird. If I'm being honest, I like the Knights Cavalry, but again, they're basically just another version of the Horseback Knight, and they appear a whopping 9 times throughout the game. I guess I get why there would be multiple of them, given how obviously inspired by the Nazgul that they are, but at least the Nazgul had the Witch King to stand out as their leader. The Knights Cavalry are literally just reskinned enemies. Oh, and of course, at one point you fight 2 of them at once. How creative. Another boss that stood out to me for all the wrong reasons is the Red Wolf of Radagon, or the Red Wolf of the Champion, depending on your preference. I don't know. Mechanically speaking, it took a grand total of 5 seconds for me to identify that this thing is literally just the Champion's Gravetender, which itself was just Sif with an expanded moveset. Only now it has some magical projectiles tied to some of its attacks, and visually it's actually just the character model reskin of the wolf you pray to for the Abyss Covenant in Dark Souls 3. Unfortunately, compared to Dark Souls 3, which had tasteful homages to past Souls work like the Abyss Watchers and Orlando and the Soul of Cinder, Elden Ring's idea of paying homage is pretty much just hard copying content that fans loved, at least mostly, from the older games, and this is far from the only example. Trust me, there are many more to come. It's also just comical at this point how much FromSoft wants to use dog enemies, but just for whatever reason refuses to make a new dog enemy, barring I guess Bloodborne. Even the dog bosses at this point are just copying the first dog boss they made over a decade ago. I do not know why FromSoft is so averted to designing new dog enemies specifically, but at the very least, it is funny. But when it comes to the sheer volume of recycling, almost nothing in Elden Ring comes close to just how laughable the Erdtree Avatar is. Bear in mind, this thing is a copy-paste down to its very moveset, barring a couple of magical projectiles and an AoE tacked onto a couple of attacks, or in certain cases Scarlet Rot, of the Asylum Demon from Dark Souls, which appeared once in Dark Souls 3, 3 times in the first Dark Souls, and if you think about it, the Asylum Demon is actually a repurposed Demon Vanguard from Demon Souls, which itself was used twice in that game, and if you really want to be a dick about it, shows up 2 more times in the remake. Obviously, it's not fair to count that. I'm just being a prick at this point. But seriously, was it really necessary to copy-paste a PS3 boss from half a dozen games ago, multiple console generations ago, 14 times across Elden Ring? No, I did not misspeak. You did not hear me wrong. The Erdtree Avatar is used 14 times across the entirety of Elden Ring, and don't forget that one of those times sees it appearing as a double boss. Why, Elden Ring? Someone tell me why! Speaking of old school Dark Souls being repurposed out the wazoo, hey, does anyone else remember when Gargoyles were cool? Back in 2011? Hey, wouldn't it be so totally epic if they were made lankier and could spin with faster RPM than a fucking helicopter propeller? Wouldn't it be cool if they also had AoEs that border on being actually impossible to react to, let alone successfully dodge thanks to their massive hitboxes, especially while riding Torrent? A mechanic that you would think would specialize in getting you out of harm's way thanks to its speed. Oh, and wouldn't it be great if they also dealt outrageously high damage while also having awkwardly lanky hitboxes, which are themselves always on the move because of their sheer speed? Oh, and why not give poison to one of them too? Because, you know, it just makes sense for this magical stone thing to vomit poison. That sure sounds like it would be a hard enemy. Gotta maintain that big dog mega hard souls rep after all. Like, no, seriously, why can a magical gargoyle vomit poison gas? I have no idea, but hey, at least it makes the game harder, right? Indeed it does. At least, you know, until you find out how to clown the boss so hard that it doesn't even become a tangible threat anymore. So hey, congratulations FromSoft, you made yet another hard boss. Unfortunately, you forgot to make it a good boss before you started hitting copy-paste multiple times over. I'm not a fan of the Valiant Gargoyles, am I getting that across? What can I even say about them that you aren't likely aware of? Even among die-hard fans of this game, these things have a reputation as one of the worst bosses in the game, so I doubt I need to explain why a handful of them being copy-pasted around the map was kind of a crap idea. Oh, and you know what? Speaking of enemies with a bad reputation, Let's talk about the Burial Watchdogs. These really feel like a Dark Souls 2 boss. On their own, they are a complete and total non-threat with very basic attacks and health bars that can be dispatched of with relative ease, even with a pretty mid build. Put two of them in a room together though, and all of a sudden, hey, they're pretty damn hard because none of their attacks have any form of recognizable synergy. So you're basically just finding whatever opportunity you can to poke at them for damage. So hey, congrats FromSoft, you successfully made yet another hard boss. Unfortunately, you forgot to make it a good one when it's by itself before you started hitting the copy-paste. And then we have one that is probably the funniest boss they've ever made, if not one of them. I'm talking about none other than Godefroy, a boss that I legitimately thought was a shitpost when I first heard about it. No, I am not kidding, I saw an image of it and I thought that it had to be an edit because there was no way they would do something so fucking stupid, but nope. Turns out they unironically copy-pasted a named boss with lore that explains his very appearance and tried to pass it off as his evil twin brother. All the while giving it one of the most laughably stupid and terrible names I think I have ever heard. Seriously, Godefroy. His name is Godefroy. And apparently he also had a thing for grafting limbs onto himself, I guess. Gee, what a coinky-dink. They seriously just slapped a funky blue coat of paint on him and took off the second phase. That's it, that's all they did, my god. Then there's Godfrey's Golden Spirit, which I cannot explain the presence of this. In-universe, I'm sure the Erdtree did a funny or something, but design-wise, the only reason I can even fathom them including this was to pad the game out. It's just phase 1 of a later fight thrown into a random spot with no context or purpose. That's it, that is all it is. They just copy-pasted phase 1 of a boss and slapped it somewhere else with a fresh gold coat of paint. It is literally Godefroy, albeit less funny because they didn't give him a stupid new name. Does anyone else remember when FromSoft bosses had actual purpose behind them? Like, yeah, not every boss in Dark Souls is a winner, alright? I'm not gonna pretend that the Capra Demon or the Ceaseless Discharge were amazing bosses, but god damn it, at least they didn't make up such major portions of the game's content. Then there's the Tibia Mariner, which I actually kinda like. It's a simple boss, not exactly setting the world on fire or anything, but the aesthetic is pretty damn cool, and it has a passable enough moveset. It's far from challenging, but at least it doesn't feel lazy or tacked on. Until you find it half a dozen more times. God damn it, Elden Ring, what is your fetish with recycling content? Why are you like this? It's almost like the devs didn't have enough content to justify such a massive game, so they just threw together whatever they could, wherever they could. Here's a thought, if you don't have the content to justify such a massive map, maybe, just maybe, the map doesn't need to be so fucking gigantic. Yeah, it looks cool, but when you actually play through it, it's a fucking joke. Speaking of which, the Magma Wyrm was a boss that I initially liked quite a bit. My first encounter with it was just prior to the Altus Plateau, and it was pretty damn good. The boss itself is pretty cool on an aesthetic level. It hits hard, but doesn't move so fast or cover so much area with its attacks that it completely overwhelms you. The arena was fantastic, and the magma pools it left in its wake did a great job at forcing me to maintain environmental awareness in a way that didn't feel cumbersome alongside his behavior. I had a really good time fighting this thing, and it was really satisfying to finally claim that victory. Then I encountered it inside a mine in Caelid and on the side of a mountain near Gelmir. Both of those arenas did nothing to account for the actual size and animations of the Magma Wyrm, and overall were just so bad that they completely ruined the boss for me. I seriously want to like you, Elden Ring, but I swear every time you have a good idea, you just have to go and fuck it up. Hey guys, stop me if you've heard this one before. When I first encountered the Crystalian, I thought it was so damn cool. Having to chip away at it as I wore down its defensive capability made for a really interesting fight. I had to start out being smart with my attacks, and it felt rewarding to execute that strategy. And I felt like a real badass as I started to bludgeon it closer and closer to death with each swing of my weapon. It was also the boss that taught me the value of using a mix of light and heavy attacks, specifically within Elden Ring at least. Utilizing more heavy attacks also meant taking the time to learn its moves, which thankfully were never so over the top that I struggled to get a grasp by analyzing the situation and playing safely. It rewarded my patience, it rewarded those well-timed attacks, and the bell bearing was a fantastic reward for finally defeating the boss. I came out of this fight genuinely more satisfied than I did most other bosses. Seriously, I love this fight. Want to take a guess at what happens next? But there's one more boss that we have yet to discuss on the topic of recycling, a boss that wasn't just bad on its own, but gets reused countless times throughout the game. More so than any other boss, more than the Erdtree Avatar, more than the Knight's Cavalry, and even more than the most minor of side dungeon bosses like the Black Knife Assassins or Pumpkinhead. More so than the demi-humans, more so than the dragons, more than anything else you will find in this game. I refer, of course, to none other than the Soldier of Godric. No, I am not kidding. They took a basic enemy and made it into a tutorial boss. They actually did that. It is a thing that they did, unironically, a basic soldier enemy. Oh my god, this is embarrassing. I sincerely do not think that anything could better exemplify the problem with Elden Ring's approach to boss recycling. You can seriously just take any old enemy from the game, no matter how weak they are, slap a health bar on it, throw in some background music, and just put it wherever you want. That is all it takes to make a boss fight anymore. After all, Souls fans love their bosses, so hey, cram as many of those bad boys in as you can. Then we get to boast about how Elden Ring has the biggest boss roster of all of our games combined. No, but seriously, could you imagine if every single common soldier enemy had a fucking boss health bar and boss music? I really hope I've made my point. Elden Ring has a serious problem with recycling both its bosses and assets from previous games in an attempt to pad out the runtime with enough content, no doubt due to the sheer scale of the open world. Unfortunately, From forgot to apply the old mantra of less is more, and the constant spamming of bosses has left the game with an utterly diluted sense of what even constitutes a boss fight anymore. Bosses in older From titles were designed to serve as exciting and often innovative capstones to the levels they were placed in, measures of your progression both stat-wise and in terms of mechanical skill. In Elden Ring, bosses simply exist to populate the massive world and occasionally provide a challenge. And I do mean only occasionally. Alright, but it's time to ask the real question. Which is worse? Astel being reused and still being called Astel? Or Godric being reused and being called Godefroy?